All right, today we are unpacking the incredible story of Ecuador. It's this nation whose history is just this constant, back and forth cycle of conflict and resilience, and it stretches all the way from ancient empires right up to the crises making headlines today.
To really get what's happening in Ecuador now, you gotta look at what happened in early 2024. The government actually declared an internal armed conflict. I mean, think about that. It's basically a war on its own soil against these incredibly powerful drug gangs. It was just a shocking move, and it threw the country right into the global spotlight.
But here's the thing, a crisis this big, it doesn't just appear out of nowhere, right? It grows from really, really deep historical roots. So the big question is, how did Ecuador get to this point? Well, the answer is tangled up in centuries of conflict, these crazy economic booms and busts, and divisions that just run so deep. So let's trace that story, right, from the very beginning.
All right, so here's our game plan. We're gonna start with Ecuador's ancient roots and the Inca Empire. Then we'll jump into the Spanish colonial era, see how the independent nation was born, look at a really wild century of turmoil, and then the age of oil and dollars. And finally, we'll connect all those dots to see how it leads to today's unsettled present.
Okay, let's kick it off with Section 1, From Ancient Roots to Empire. Because, long, long before the Spanish ever showed up, this land was home to some incredibly sophisticated cultures, with a history that goes back for millennia. And I mean, we're talking about a history that evolved over thousands of years. It starts with early hunter-gatherers. Then you get the rise of farming and pottery in what's called the formative period. From there, you see these really distinct regional cultures pop up. And finally, tribes start banding together into these big confederations, right before the Incas show up on the scene. And honestly, these early societies were just so advanced. I mean, take the Valdivia culture, for example. We're talking as far back as 3,500 BCE. They were one of the very first cultures in all of the Americas to use pottery. And they weren't just sitting still, they were master navigators, building these huge trade networks that connected the coast, the Andes, and even the Amazon. So, the last big indigenous power to rule this whole region, that was the Incas. They conquered the area in the 1400s, and it was not an easy fight. They met some really fierce resistance. But here's the crazy part. Their empire here was incredibly brief. It lasted only about 50 years, because just then, a totally new, disruptive force appeared on the horizon, and that was the Spanish. And that brings us to Section 2, the Spanish colonial crucible. The arrival of the Spanish kicked off a 300-year period that would completely reshape society, the economy, pretty much everything. Now, at the absolute heart of the colonial economy was this system called the encomienda. On paper, it was a grant of land and indigenous labor. But in reality, it was basically a system of virtual slavery. This is what built the colony's wealth and created this powerful landowning class that would go on to dominate the country for centuries. This era also cemented a division that, let me tell you, defines Ecuador to this day. You had the coastal city of Guayaquil, which grew into this bustling, liberal hub for trade. And then up in the highlands, you had Quito, the conservative center of government and religion. This rivalry, the coast versus the Sierra, it became the central theme, really the main drama of Ecuadorian history. Which, of course, brings us to Section 3, Forging an Independent Nation. See, Ecuador's birth wasn't just about fighting off Spain. It was a struggle that was shaped by these exact internal conflicts. The road to independence, well, it was a long one. It started with an early rebellion in Quito. It really picked up steam in Guayaquil, and then it all came to a head at the decisive Battle of Pichincha. For a hot minute there, Ecuador was part of Simón Bolívar's big dream of a united Gran Colombia. But by 1830, that dream had kind of fizzled out, and Ecuador was left to stand on its own. And what happened immediately? That old regional rivalry just hardened into the nation's defining political fight. On one side, you had the conservatives up in Highland Quito. They represented the church and the powerful landowners. The folks whose power came straight from that old colonial system. And on the other side, you had the liberals, down on the coast in Guayaquil. They were all about the merchants, the banks, and a more secular state. This was way more than just politics. It was a full-blown culture war. And it was a brutal one. This quote, wow, it just perfectly captures how intense this struggle was. When the super powerful conservative dictator Gabriel Garcia Moreno was assassinated, the exiled liberal writer Juan Montalvo basically took credit, not with a gun, but with his words. He famously said, "My pen killed him." So yeah, Ecuador enters the 20th century deeply, deeply divided.
And that sets the stage perfectly for Section 4, a century of turmoil, where these economic booms and busts just poured gasoline on the political fire.
The Liberals finally got their chance to run things at the turn of the century, and they were riding a huge boom in cacao exports. I mean, this was Ecuador's Gilded Age. All that money funded massive projects, like the railroad that finally connected the rival cities of Guayaquil and Quito. It also allowed for major reforms, like the separation of church and state.
But the boom didn't last. And the stability definitely didn't last either. The rest of the 20th century was just this revolving door of presidents and military coups. And the career of this one guy, Jose Maria Velasco Ibarra, is the perfect symbol for all this chaos. Get this, he was elected president 5 different times, but he was so populist and so unpredictable that he only actually managed to finish 1 full term.
So, this chaos leads us right into the modern era and our 5th section, oil, dollars, and revolution. The discovery of oil was about to change everything, bringing incredible wealth, yeah, but also brand new kinds of crises. By the late 90s, the country was in a total economic meltdown. There was a banking crisis, hyperinflation was out of control, and the national currency, the sucre, was practically worthless. The government had to do something drastic, something desperate. So in 2000, they did. They just abandoned their own currency and adopted the US dollar. Out of the ashes of that crisis rose a figure who would absolutely dominate the next decade, Rafael Correa. He came to power just as oil prices were soaring, and he launched his Citizens' Revolution, a huge leftist project that just poured oil money into massive social programs and dramatically expanded the power of the state. And you know what? The results were pretty undeniable. During his time in office, you can see the poverty rate just plummeted from over 36% all the way down to about 22%. We're talking millions of Ecuadorians lifted out of poverty. But this revolution was all funded by debt. The Correa government borrowed a ton of money, especially from China. And by the time he left office, the national debt stood at over $64 billion. The bill for all this spending was about to come due. And that, my friends, brings our story full circle to our final section, Ecuador's unsettled present. This is where we see how the bill for that last decade has well and truly come due. And the pattern that followed was just swift and brutal. Correa's successor, Lenin Moreno, he slammed on the brakes with austerity measures, which sparked massive protests. His successor, Guillermo Lasso, faced the exact same cycle of protests and eventually had to dissolve Congress using this wild constitutional tool called muerte cruzada, or mutual death. All of this constant instability created a huge power vacuum. And who filled that vacuum? The drug gangs, which leads us directly to the current armed conflict under President Daniel Noboa. So, we end right where we began. Ecuador's history is this amazing story of cultural richness and resilience, for sure. But it's also a story of these divisions that just will not go away. Coast versus Sierra, boom versus bust, revolution versus austerity. The question today, the one that hangs over everything, is whether the nation can finally find a path to overcome them. If you want to see how Ecuador's story stacks up against its neighbors, you should definitely check out our Quick Country Histories playlist. And hey, for more deep dives just like this one, make sure you subscribe to Notebook Summaries. Thanks for watching.